Hey, what's up everybody? It's Dan Pickett here, co-founder at Launch Academy, and I'm here to bring you another episode diving into the semantic structure of the hypertext markup language. Today we're going to divide and conquer and really dive into some of the specifics of the HTML elements and what those elements semantically mean. We're also going to talk a little bit more and dive into the landscape of modern web development, what it means to be a standards compliant web developer, what responsive design is all about, and some of the popular browsers that are out there out in the ecosystem and how that affects the work that we do as professional web developers. We're also going to look at meta elements. We're also going to explore attributes and values as part of our deep dive into HTML elements. And for the first time, we're going to actually validate our markup using a validator service that the W3C provides for us. And lastly, we're going to divide into some HTML comments and how to kind of document and hide our markup as our web pages get longer and longer. We'll also look at how to incorporate special characters through the use of HTML entities. And lastly, we'll conclude with basically an exploration of how to get help when you're stuck, which is a really important skill. So stick around with me, stay with me. You definitely want to stick around for that last portion of today's episode. All right, so before we dive into the homework that I assigned in the previous episode and take a look at some of the work that I did there, let's first talk about the landscape of modern web development. So when I mentioned web standards in the last episode, I talked about an organization known as the W3C.org. And the W3C is basically a standards organization, not unlike the IEEE is for engineering or what the FCC is for radio and communications. The W3C is basically this board of technical people that are basically trying to regulate the way in which web pages are built. And they regulate them for a very important reason. And that is a belief that is core to the internet in the World Wide Web. And that is that the World Wide Web should be consumable or accessible by everyone. Everyone, whether they're hearing impaired, visually impaired, otherwise disabled, they should still have access to the information on the web. So the W3C exists to basically provide a standard for us all to follow as web developers so that we can make our web pages accessible primarily to those that are visually impaired. And that's why we talk about the semantic markup in the structure of our page so that for example, if I'm visually impaired, I can literally use a web browser that will read the structure of my web page back to me. So the idea of using a screen reader is something that's very common for those that are visually impaired. And a visually impaired individual is going to have a better experience with our web pages if we're being standards compliant and we're writing accessible, beautiful markup. So that's one reason to use standards compliant markup and basically follow the rules that the W3C has provided for us. There are other reasons. So one of the most important reasons is that there are different web browsers out there in the web development ecosystem. So for the purposes of this course, we're using the Google Chrome web browser as I've shown here. But not everyone uses the same web browser. So some folks might use Microsoft's Internet Explorer. Some folks might use Mozilla Firefox or Opera or Safari, which comes by default on the Mac operating system, right? So all these different browsers have different ways of displaying HTML web pages. And if we don't follow standards and we don't write accessible standards compliant markup, my web page might look very different from browser to browser. And what we call this is browser incompatibility. And this is a really big problem that we deal with as web developers. And one of the best ways to safeguard against our users having different experiences from web browser to web browser is to write standards compliant markup, or markup that is basically approved and recognized by the W3C organization to be standards compliant. So it's really, really important, most of all, for us to be able to deliver a consistent website experience for our users through the use of accessible and standards compliant markup. The other big reason is, you may have heard of this place called Google. Well, Google kind of runs the search engine game at the time of this recording, and Google and other search engines will basically download our entire HTML web page and start to understand the semantic structure or the outline that we alluded to in the previous episode. And if we don't have well-formed markup, if we don't have standards compliant markup, Google and other popular search engines like Bing or Yahoo will actually penalize us and will be less likely to show up in search results that are relevant to the web pages that we're producing. So we adhere to W3C standards for the reasons of being good web citizens and providing for a web page experience that is accessible by everyone, regardless of their disability, including those that are visually impaired. We write it so that we get browser compatibility and we get a similar experience from browser to browser, no matter what web browser that user is working on. And we use it so that search engines have a better understanding of the ideas and content that we're trying to convey to our end user. So these are all really important reasons why you want to write good semantic markup. And what does it mean to write good semantic markup? Well, we talked about in our previous episode, and if we go to that code pen, let me go ahead and open that code pen here. Go to my profile here, pull up our collection. We talked about how the H1 tag is essentially telling the web browser that this material, the hi from HTML, the inner HTML of this H1 tag, is some of the most important content on the page. And what we're doing here through the use of a P element indicated by the less than and greater than sign and then the P immediately in between, we're basically saying that this is a paragraph of text. So every element that we use in the context of our HTML web page has what we call semantic meaning. It gives a hint about what the inner HTML, what the content inside it represents. So just like we are saying here that the head tag is going to contain all kinds of meta information about our web page, and the body tag semantically is going to basically represent that all of the presentational material is going to show up inside the body tag. We have presentational components like the H1 tag and the P tag that have special meaning for basically the structure or the outline of our document. So just like you would outline your document with headers and subheaders in your word processing, we can do the same through the use of hypertext markup language. So it's really important to write markup that is standards compliant and accessible. But one thing that we should also talk about from the perspective of the landscape of modern web development is that with the proliferation of mobile devices and tablets and even TV screens, we need to be able to adapt to different features in different screen sizes as our web page is produced. We call this technique responsive design. And the best way to write web pages that are adaptive to the experiences of our users, whether they're pulling up our web page on their mobile phone or on their tablet or on their desktop computer, that they would get an optimal experience. Well, the best way for that to happen, as you may have guessed, is to write semantic and standards compliant markup. So it's really, really important to kind of drive home this point that if you want to write accessible, good-looking code that's going to look great across all different browsers, whether on your mobile device or on your tablet or on your local machine, you want to do so through writing code that is standards compliant. So what does it mean to be standards compliant? So let's take a look at what it means to do W3C validation. So basically what we can do is we can run our code through a checker that will basically say, hey, you're good, you're adhering to all the standards that we're putting out as part of the W3C. And before we do that, we have to look at some of the specifics of our HTML markup that gives the W3C validator a hint around what we're using as a markup language. And that really starts through the exploration of the doc type. So the doc type here is going to give us a hint as to what version of HTML we're using. And this doc type is basically defaulting to the latest example of HTML5. So this doc type is basically saying we're using the latest available standard for HTML. So this is going to give the W3C validator, when we run this code through it, a hint at what we're using for W3C markup. Okay, so I'm going to take this markup and I'm going to copy it, and I'm going to run it through our validator. And you can run it through by going to w3.org, and you can click on HTML here in the lower right hand corner. And we want to validate by direct input, and we're going to paste in the markup that I just produced. And one thing I want to do is I also want to make sure that I check this show outline checkbox. And I'm going to show you why that's important in just a minute. So we're going to hit the check button here. And as developers, we love this green signal. This green signal is showing us that we've produced standards compliant markup. The validator that W3C has provided for us is basically saying that we've written very good markup. There are no issues with our HTML web page. And the reason why it was important also to show the outline, which I thought I had checked here, let's check it again, is we're going to start to get an understanding of how the W3C represents our document. So here we use an H1 tag to flag the most important content on the page. And the W3C validator is starting to give us perspective on what that outline looks like. And this can help us from a search engine optimization standpoint and just from a writing good semantic markup standpoint. Cool, okay. So we're going to talk a little bit more about the validator later, but for now, suffice to say, we want to accept the understanding that writing good standards compliant markup is going to result in a better web experience for your end users. All right, so we started with this simple web page, and I had charged you with the task of basically writing a little bit more of a complicated web page for yourself in the context of information about you. And I've gone ahead and done that, and I've actually made it a little advanced. And don't worry if you're overwhelmed immediately looking at this about all the different elements that we're using. We're going to explore each and every single one and talk about their semantic meaning as we walk through this HTML web page. So as I mentioned, we start here with a doc type, and this tells web browsers, the W3C validator, and search engines what version of HTML we're using. And in this case, we're using the latest version of HTML, or HTML5 at the time of this recording. Now, notice too that my HTML tag looks a little bit different from our most basic example. And that's because I'm using an attribute and an attribute value. And with HTML elements, I can basically tweak or qualify an HTML element with additional settings. And we call those settings attributes. And what we're doing here is we're telling web browsers and search engines that my HTML web page is coded in the English language. So we use the attribute lang and the attribute value en to basically give a hint to web browsers that we're building a web page with the use of the English language. And we separate attributes from their values using an equal sign, and we put attribute values in quotes. So we call this an attribute, and we call the en value here the attribute value. And we put attributes in their attribute values inside the opening element for our given HTML element. And we can use this attribute and attribute value paradigm to basically get more specific about the HTML element that we're using. Cool. Okay. So we talked a little bit about the head tag, but semantically what the head tag represents is all the meta information that our HTML web page is dealing with. So for search engines in particular, this is useful information that basically gives us a hint at what this web page is going to be about. So we set the HTML title inside the head tag, and this HTML title gives the search engines as well as the browser kind of an indicator of what this web page is specifically about. So just like we would put a title on our book report or put a title on our dissertation, we put our title on our HTML web page so that search engines and web browsers get a hint at what the web page is all about. Also, we're going to set the character encoding, which is also important. We're going to talk about encoding just a little bit in just a little bit. But notice here that we're using the attribute char set and the attribute value UTF-8. And you can pretty much copy and paste this in all of your future HTML documents if you're writing web pages using the English language. And we'll explore why in just a little bit. Next, we set keywords and descriptions for search engine purposes. And back in the day, we used to be able to set a meta element with the name attribute value of keywords. And we used to be able to put all kinds of stuff in here and trick search engines into thinking that our web page may be about something benevolent, but actually might be either an X-rated site or not about the content that the web page actually represented. So malicious web page developers could use this practice called keyword stuffing to essentially cheat search engines with keywords that are not about the HTML web page that we're trying to represent. Search engines have since gotten quite intelligent about that, so you want to make sure that your meta keywords always have content values that represent what's actually reflected in the body of our HTML web page. Otherwise, search engines will actually penalize you, and you're less likely to show up in search engine rankings if you have keywords that actually aren't represented in the presentational aspect of your HTML web page. And then likewise, we use the meta with a name attribute value of description to basically show the user the description of the web page when it shows up in the search results. So for example, if we Google learn to code, what we're seeing here is all of the meta descriptions that each web page has produced that gives us an idea of what the meta descriptions are. So the meta description that we put in our HTML web page is what will show up underneath the link on our search engine result page. So that about rounds us out on the basics of what we would see particularly in our head tag. Let's explore some more elements that would appear in our body tag. So we talked about in the previous episode the importance of the H1 tag and the paragraph tag. And the paragraph tag semantically just means a paragraph of text. So let's compare and contrast this paragraph of text with the second paragraph of text that I've created here. Notice that I've just got straight up sort of simple text in our page here, in our paragraph tag here, but in the second paragraph tag we have the use of what's called an inline element, and we use the strong tag in the EM tag, which is short for emphasis, to basically highlight certain text inside our block level element that basically gives us the ability to highlight certain text and call attention to certain text. So in this case, I wanted to call out my dog's name, and we can do the same here with Apple by putting Apple inside a pair of strong tags. And this basically just calls stronger attention to that text in the context of our paragraph tag. So if I'm a search engine, I'm looking at Linux and Apple with more weight than any of the other words that appear inside this paragraph tag. And likewise, we can add emphasis to certain keywords in our block level elements to basically call attention to additional elements. And let's go ahead and open this in our web browser and see how this affects the aesthetic view of both of those tags. So we see the use of strong for Linux and Apple here, and we see the use of emphasis for golden doodles here, and we can see that the browser's default behavior, which we can later override with cascading style sheets, to use bold to indicate that Linux and Apple are shown as strong elements on our page, and that golden doodles is shown as italics. But semantically, what we're showing here is that we want to add emphasis to all three words. Cool. Okay, so notice too that I've also incorporated an image into my HTML web page. And an image tag, it's really important to have both a source attribute and an alt attribute. The source attribute is going to point somewhere on the web for us to basically work and retrieve that image and download it and display it on our web page. And what we can do here is we can go to Google's image search and we can search for different images that are uploaded and available to us on the web. So if I Google golden doodles, for example, I can get all kinds of pictures of golden doodles. And if I click on one, I can click on view image, and I can see that this JPEG is available to us on the web. You might have to search around a little bit to find one that is actually existent. This one looks like my younger dog, Apple. And what we get is a URL that points to that specific image that's hosted somewhere else on the web. And I can modify the source that I've used here to point to this new image. And watch what happens on my web page when I refresh the page. And again, let's put the markup side by side with the HTML web page here. And you can see that the image has been updated to point to this new image that's hosted on the web. Now, one caveat that I think is super important to mention here with the image tag is that we've used an image that someone else has posted on the web. When I go to Google image search and I search for an image, I'm getting someone else's image. That means they own the rights to that image. So you want to make sure that if you're incorporating this as a professional design, or if you're using this image for commercial purposes, that you have the rights to use that image. So just like you can copyright a book or you can copyright a song, you can copyright an image and you can copyright an HTML web page. So you want to be careful not to use someone else's property without their permission. A cool little trick that you can use if you're interested in repurposing images that are available to us on the web, if you're using Google image search, you can actually customize your search to basically look for images that are labeled for reuse. So all of these images I can reuse by permission of the author. Some authors will require me to give credit to the original person that posted that image, but just make sure that you're adhering to, and again, being a good web citizen, if you're borrowing someone else's image, make sure that you have their permission to do so. The other important thing that you should note is when you use someone else's image, for example, we're using an image that's hosted on petsguide.com, .bsassets.com. This is the host that is hosting that image. If that service ever goes down, my image will no longer be available to me. Watch what happens in that case. So if I update this to a URL that's no longer valid, watch what happens when I refresh my page. I get this broken image indicator, and I get the alt text that I've populated in the alt attribute of my image. And this is known conventionally as a broken image, and it's because I've relied on an external service for the purposes of my image. And we call this a fully qualified a fully qualified URL because it has a protocol, it has a host, and it has a path. And later, when we start to work with pages that involve other images and involve actually linking to other pages, we'll show you how you can use both relative and absolute paths in the context of your own web page to prevent this from happening. But for now, we're using fully qualified URLs, and know that you're at the sort of behest of the hosts that are providing them. Great. Okay, so we talked about how we can go as far as H6 tags to basically reflect the structural hierarchy of our HTML document. And what I've done in the context of completing my own homework is I've shown that "Hi, I'm Dan Pickett" is more important, is an H1 tag, to the subservient H2 hobbies, goals, and social media tags. So I represent this outline through the context of an H1 tag, and then showing H2 tags as sort of sub-bullets under that H1 tag. So what I'm starting to do is I'm starting to represent the semantic outline of my HTML web page using H1 tags and H2 tags, and I can go all the way down to H6 tags as needed to basically represent that information hierarchy. And so much of what we do as front-end web developers is represent information through that semantic hierarchy. So we talked about the image tag. We talked about the importance of the alt tag for the purposes of what happens when an image is non-existent. But I also want to talk a little bit about the alt tag from an accessibility standpoint. We talked about making the internet a place that's accessible by all, including those that are visually impaired. So they may not be able to visually see the image that you're representing or trying to convey in your HTML web page. So what's going to happen is the browser that a visually impaired person is going to use is going to be represented by this alt text. So the screen, the screen reader is essentially going to signal to the visually impaired individual that you are trying to show them an image of a golden doodle puppy. So whenever you have an image tag, you're typically going to see a source tag, but you always want to incorporate an alt tag in conjunction with that source tag. And that's for accessibility purposes. Cool, so we talked about the image inline element. Let's talk about the anchor tag. So the anchor tag, as I've indicated here, is going to have an href attribute. And this gives us the ability to link off to other web pages. And this is really the power and the fury of HTML in the World Wide Web, is that I can refer to other documents that are publicly available and point users to those via hyperlink. So we call the A tag an anchor tag, and most anchor tags are going to have this href attribute. And in this case, like we used in the images, we're going to use a fully qualified URL with the protocol, the host, and I'm selecting and highlighting those, and then the path here. And that's going to point off, in this case, to my Twitter profile. And then in the subsequent list item, we're going to see the link off to my GitHub profile. So if I go ahead and I click on those links, and I'm holding down Command here to open them up in new tabs as I click, it's going to take me to my social media profile on Twitter, and it's going to take me to my GitHub profile as well. So we can use the anchor tag to basically point to destinations external to the web page that we're producing. Also, what's really neat is that we can actually point to sections of our web page using what's known as the hashtag. So here, what we're going to do is we're going to create a new element that points to different places in our HTML document. And I'm going to talk about the unordered list in just a bit, but for now, just bear with me as I produce this markup. So in this case, notice that there's no protocol or host in my href. And what I'm doing here is I'm pointing to a named location on my web page. So right now, if I actually refresh my page, this is not going to jump anywhere, right? So here we see the location mark that indicates hobbies. The URL is updated, but there's no behavior that actually is rendered on the actual web page. But if I go ahead and I name this h2 with an ID attribute of hobbies, I'm going to actually create this jump effect. See how it navigates me further down the page, and because my page is not that large, it's navigating me as far as it can go. But I can use this location hash, or this hash mark, to basically point to specific locations on my HTML web page. So we use the combination of an ID attribute, which can only be unique per one element per page. We use this ID attribute in this special kind of href to provide this mechanism where we can jump from location to location on an HTML web page. You tend to see this type of functionality on a frequently asked question website or something like that, where you get a very long page and it makes sense to jump from place to place. So we can use the anchor tag to basically link from destination to destination in all of our web pages. So we talked about the anchor tag and we talked about the image tag as inline elements. And it's important to understand that inline elements do not create what we know in word processing as hard returns to the left and to the right of our HTML document. So if I go ahead and I put some text here, let's see what that looks like in the context of our HTML web page. We say that this is inline content as much as the image because there is no line break to the left or to the right of it. And in the context of some of the other markup that we've produced, in this case the header tag, the unordered list, the list items themselves, and the p tag, we call those block level elements because they clear to the left and to the right, and there's a hard return so that they show as isolated on the web page. We can also see this relationship using the Chrome inspector. So if I go ahead and I inspect my header tag, we can see here that when I go and hover over the H1, the header tag here, it's going to go for the whole length, the whole width of the HTML web page. And likewise for my UL, my list item, and my p tags. However, in my image tag, notice that it only highlights the image itself. It doesn't expand beyond any of the white space that are to the left or the right of the element. And that's what we call an inline element. We can put text or other images to the left of it and it will appear side by side. So it's really important when you're learning HTML to understand the differences between inline elements and block level elements. And in this case, our image tag and our anchor tags are examples of inline elements. So for example, if I put some additional copy here, my link will appear to the right directly of the content that I put inside the list item. Great. Okay, so we've defined the nature of inline versus block elements. Let's talk a little bit about HTML comments. So we explored block level elements and we explored inline level elements. And what you may see in the context of an HTML web page is something funky like this. So what this is this is known as an HTML comment. And what I'm doing here is I'm leaving a note for myself that I want to add some additional markup here to basically represent a better image of my dog Apple. So we're using an example from the web, so I could just annotate my markup here to basically give myself a signal or a hint that I eventually want to find a better image of Apple. Likewise, I can use code comments as a way to eliminate certain pieces of copy or certain components of my HTML web page, like so. So if I highlight some text and I actually use the command/command, it's going to actually comment out my hobbies list. Watch what happens when I refresh the page. That list is no longer available. So I could use code commentary as a way to either annotate or document my HTML markup, or actually hide some content as well. So we use HTML comments in those ways in either circumstance. One thing that's really important to note is that while we have that annotation comment here on line 31, and it doesn't actually display in the context of my page, it's really important to know that whenever you make an HTML comment, it will show up in the source. So see here when we view source of our HTML copy, we see here that the comment that I've made actually shows up in the context of my markup. So just know that those comments are out there in the open. Try to keep them professional. Don't have swears and unprofessional language in your HTML comments. Super important if you're using it as an annotation mechanism. Cool. All right, so other funky things that you may see in HTML. You may see what we call HTML entities. And essentially, HTML entities provide us with a way to represent special characters in the context of our HTML markup. So for example, if I wanted to indicate that my markup was copyrighted, I could use the escape sequence to indicate that I want to use the copyright symbol to basically put that round C symbol at the bottom of my page. Let me just blow that up so you can see it above the watermark. And see here, we've got that C symbol that represents this concept of copyright. So we have this escape sequence that reflects an ampersand and a semicolon, and we use a sequence of characters to basically indicate what we're dealing with. Likewise, we use these escape sequences so that the code doesn't get, the markup in the browser does not get confused around what is in HTML markup versus what is to be reflected as actual characters in the context of our HTML body. So it's really important when including greater than, less than, and quotes in your HTML markup to use the proper escape entities. Otherwise, your browser may get confused as it pertains to what is actual HTML markup versus what is content that you're trying to represent on the page. So for a greater than sign, we use the ampersand and the colon with the GT characters in between. With the less than sign, we use the greater than and the ampersand in the semicolon, and then the LT characters in between. And if we want to represent a quote, we do so with the characters QUOT. So you kind of see the pattern of how we use escape characters in the context of our HTML web pages. One thing that you see a lot in modern web pages as well is the use of UTF character codes. So as I mentioned earlier in this episode, we set the character encoding here to UTF-8. And because we're doing that, and because we're basically making some assumptions about modern web browsers being able to interpret this meta element, we can actually just copy and paste, for example, this checkmark Unicode character to basically embed that in our page. And it's only because we've set the character encoding to UTF-8 that we're able to do that. So let's go ahead and say, for example, maybe I've accomplished one of these goals. I can just go ahead and copy and paste this special UTF character, and it will actually show up on my page. Alternatively, if we want to support older browsers, we can use a UTF character escape sequence. And you can find these on files, on URLs like fileformat.info to basically find special character codes to reflect these symbols that may not consistently appear in things like the alphabet. So we use the UTF-8 character set to basically provide a wide variety of symbols that we can incorporate into our HTML. So in this case, we're using the UTF character set to include a check mark. That check mark is not in what it may be known as a different character set, which we could say is something like ASCII, for example. So the UTF-8 character set, we can't go into too much detail here around this concept, but suffice to say that the UTF-8 character set is the widely available character set that provides us with all kinds of international characters, things like emojis and things like check marks. So the UTF dictionary is pretty wide and verbose and diverse, so that we can use a variety of character sets in the context of our HTML markup. If we want to use a UTF-8 character in the context of our HTML web page, we can use what's known as an escape sequence. And just like we have special character sequences to represent greater than, less than, and quote symbols, we can use the UTF hex HTML entity here to basically represent this concept of a check mark as well. So let's go ahead and add a redundant check mark here. So we see here that we've got the actual character that I've copied and pasted in from just a straight UTF-8 character set. And then we've got the escape sequence that represents that character as well. So you may see these escape sequences, and you may see these UTF-based character encodings. And the way you can tell the difference is with this hash mark in between. So this is a hexadecimal UTF representation of a character code, and this is sort of the more old school representation of it. So you can Google HTML escape sequences to learn more about the available characters and what you can put in for those different characters. And Unicode or UTF-8 is sort of the most diverse and provides with the most variety of character codes in your HTML web pages. Cool. So to close out, I just want to make mention of an important concept that we use as developers. And I want to call attention to our code in particular. So notice here how I'm making use of tabbing to basically reflect this relationship of parent and child. So I'm using tabs as a way to represent the idea that our head and our body tags are enclosed inside the HTML tag. And this really is a utility for me as a developer to be able to see the parent-child relationship in the context of my markup. So here we're representing visually that the head tag is represented underneath the HTML tag. And all the way down to our title and meta tags as well, we're showing through tabbing and indentation that our title tag and our meta tags are subservient or children to the head tag. And we follow that convention all the way down through our HTML web page to basically represent this visually for us so that we can see the hierarchical relationship of our HTML markup. Now notice some lines I've actually tabbed in the content on their own separate dedicated line. And you'll see both versions of syntax and convention. Where we have the HTML markup for a given list item on one line and HTML markup on another set of lines where the actual element is opened up on its own line, and then we have content in between it, and we have a closing tag after it. So just something to keep in mind in the context of formatting your HTML. If you use this indentation style and this indentation convention, when you come back to this code, it's going to be a lot easier to read and a lot more convenient to kind of understand and modify. So we're very big on this idea of making your job easier, working smarter and not harder. So take advantage of whitespace and indentation as a way to keep your markup clean. Now, the white space that you produce is not going to create or introduce any kind of validation error messages or anything like that. So there's no hard and fast rule on how you do this, but it's really important to maintain some kind of consistency. And your editor can assist with that process through the creation of tab spacing. So if you go to your preferences in the context of your editor, and you go and scroll down in the case of Atom here, and you want to make sure that you have soft tabs checked, and that's going to use actual space characters instead of the tab character, which can vary from editor to editor and operating system to operating system. So by convention, most developers will favor the use of soft tabs as a base to basically make the developing experience consistent from operating system to operating system. You also want to make sure that your tab length is set to 2. At Launch Academy, that's something that we like to maintain as consistent spacing. So you'll see here that we're only using 2 spaces to indicate these tabbing relationships. Great. And then lastly, I've also incorporated some elements that we did not have an opportunity to dive into in further detail. And we're not going to be able to discuss the semantic nature of every single element in the rich dictionary of HTML5. So what I would recommend is actually going to one of my favorite resources, which is the Mozilla Development Network. And you can actually just Google MDN. And this is one of the most respected places to get information as it pertains to front-end development. And it's got a wonderful section on HTML where you can actually pull up and use it as a reference to identify all the available elements and what they mean semantically in the context of your HTML web page. So go ahead and look up the unordered list and the list item, the UL and the LI tags respectively, to gain understanding of what those mean semantically, and also to understand what tags by definition can go inside those particular tags. For example, if we look at the unordered list, we can see that the only permitted content inside an unordered list are LI elements. So the W3C defines standards and rules in terms of what content can be nested within other content. And the MDN provides a wonderful resource of what markup is valid within other pieces of HTML elements. Great. So use the MDN as a resource. You also have Slack chat to answer any questions that you have, particularly around the semantic nature of HTML. And we also are big fans of a site called Stack Overflow. Be careful to make sure that the question that you have is not going to be already answered on this page. They tend to not be super friendly to newcomers, so just be careful to adhere to the rules of the community and make sure that before you ask a question that it hasn't already been asked in the community. And again, one of the beautiful things about Launch Academy is you'll always have access to our Slack chat channel, and if you're uncomfortable asking a question or posting a question to Stack Overflow, you can post it in our Slack chat and we'll be sure to answer it as best we can. So use MDN and Stack Overflow and everything that we've learned in these lessons to use some more rich markup to basically edify your biography page. Use the P tag, use the unordered list tag, use the list item tag, and explore other tags to incorporate into the context of your web page to make the semantic structure of your HTML document more meaningful for you. And as always, be sure to share your work in the Slack chat channel. And today we looked at how to basically make our web pages a little more rich through the use of additional HTML elements, through the use of HTML commentary, and through the use of our escape sequences, whether they're Unicode based or these sort of old school syntactic HTML escape entities. That's all I have for today, and we'll see you in the next episode. Keep coding, keep grinding away, and I'll see you in the Slack chat channel. Thanks, bye-bye.